Merry Christmas. I think we all know what the second most popular Christmas story ever told is. You may not realize it's the second most popular story, but in terms of reproduction and popularity, it is easily the second most popular Christmas story ever told. It was published first on December 19th, 1848. It sold out its first printing run before Christmas Eve that same year in less than 1 week. It was reprinted in the months since and in the years since hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. It is a story that has been told over and over and over again. It has been recreated. It has been given all kinds of expressions, from comic books to graphic novels. It's actually been turned into video games. It has been retold theatrically in plays from preschools to Broadway. It has been scripted as one-man shows and readers' theaters. It has been written as a ballet and an opera. It has actually been done with no words at all. In 1973 on the BBC, the pantomime artist Marcel Marceau did an entire rendition of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol without saying a single word, and everyone knew the story exactly. The first time that Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol was read over the radio was in 1923. It was made the first time for television in 1944, and it made its film debut way back in 1901. It has been reproduced theatrically on film and on television countless times, hundreds and hundreds of times. Perhaps you're familiar with a number of different versions of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I asked our staff, we had our staff Christmas party this past Tuesday, and I asked our staff to identify their top 5 favorite versions of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And so that survey came in, and I'll share with you the top 5 Christmas Carol versions that our staff identified. The number 5 favorite version of your church staff is Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, featuring the voice of Mr. Jim Backus. Tied for 4th and 3rd are 2 made-for-television versions, the 1984 version starring George C. Scott, and the 1999 version starring Patrick Stewart, or if you prefer, George Patton and Jean-Luc Picard. The number 2, the second, and I have a disagreement with the rest of our staff, but your church staff, your Riverbend staff, said the second most popular version of A Christmas Carol was the Muppets Christmas Carol. I have a disagreement with this because they also said that their favorite of your Riverbend church staff, which tells you what a wacky place this is, their favorite version of A Christmas Carol is the 1999 version by Bill Murray called Scrooged. Now, what I'm interested in this morning is finding out what your favorite version is. So if you have your phones with you, if you're at home, maybe you can go on your computer and go to www.menti.com. When you get to menti.com, it will show you a screen and ask you to enter a code. The code you enter is 5109916. And when you enter that, hit submit, and then you will find a list of versions of A Christmas Carol. This will only allow you to vote for your favorite one time. But that will send all the data to us, and we will tell you, according to your votes as the Riverbend community what your favorite version of a Christmas carol is. While you're doing that, I want to share with you what my prayer is for us today. And my prayer today is, as it is every Sunday, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in God's sight. That God would use his word spoken by his servant and anointed by his Spirit. Today specifically, my prayer is to remind us of the transforming power of the story of Christmas. That this, every year, when we enter this season, is an opportunity for us to be changed. And it's my prayer today that we would understand where that power comes from, the nature of that transforming power. Now, as you're considering which of the versions of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is your favorite, I want us to consider what the number one Christmas story is. If the Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is the second most popular Christmas story ever told, what is the first most popular Christmas story ever told? Well, it's obviously the original one, the gospel story, the story that we celebrate every year for the last 2,000 years, the story that is recorded in the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, it's interesting that of the four Gospels, none of them recorded exactly the same way. In fact, the Gospel of Mark doesn't even mention the story of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Scholars will tell you that the reason for that is because the Gospel of Mark is the story of the servant of man, that Jesus was manifesting for us, the perfect servant. And no one cares where a servant came from. No one cares what a servant's background is. No one cares who a servant's parents are. So Mark begins his story of Jesus of Nazareth 30 years after the birth with the arrival of John the Baptist. Now, Matthew and Luke include all of the historical context, each in their own way, portraying Jesus as the Son of Man and Jesus as the promised Messiah. And the details that they include are particular to the story that they're telling. But the one of the Gospels who records the most interesting version of the story of the birth of Jesus, the story of Christmas, is the Gospel of John. Because the Gospel of John does not include any of the historical markers. If you read the beginning of the book of John, you will not find any indication about the virgin birth or the young couple that had to travel to Bethlehem because of a Roman census. You won't find anything about there being no room in the hotel and they were forced to sleep in a barn, and how this young woman named Mary gave birth to her firstborn child in the barn, and they wrapped him in strips of cloth and laid him in a feeding trough. You won't find any of those details in John. You'll find no description of the sheep or the cattle lowing. You'll find no description of the Star of Bethlehem or the shepherds or the angelic visit. You won't even find mention that a number of years later, wise men, magi from the east, made their way and found the Christ child and offered him gold and frankincense and myrrh. John includes none of it. There are no historical markers in John's record of the birth of Christ. He boils it down to its theological essence. And he records the story of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth in one verse. In John chapter 1, in verse 14, it says, the Word became flesh. The word for John is the Greek word logos. It's what he introduced at the beginning of the chapter when he said that the logos was with God and the logos was God. And then he says that logos, the Word, became flesh and made his habitation, made his dwelling. He lived where we live. He experienced what we experienced. And we have seen the glory, the one and only, the unique in human history display of the glory of God directly from the Father. And that he was full of grace and truth. It's easy for us to just do a drive-by on that theological distillation of the story of the birth of Christ. But it's there in the essence of what John is saying that we get a glimpse of the impossible convergence that the birth of Jesus of Nazareth represents, because it's a convergence of heaven and earth. It is the impossible combination of perfect divinity and perfect humanity. It is the convergence of the two opposites, of the holiness of God and the frailty and vulnerability of man. Because the story that John points us to is the story of one who was 100% God and impossibly at the same time 100% man. And he describes this convergence as the fullness of grace and truth. 100% grace and 100% truth. Now, we're familiar with grace. We, particularly here at Riverbend, grace is one of those ideas that forms the foundation. It defines the character of this community, because we are a people of grace, and we cherish the idea of grace, as we should, because grace is a gift. Grace is undeserved favor. And I like the way that we think of grace. When we think of grace here, we think of grace as a second chance. We think of grace as a new beginning, as a fresh start. We love to say that you can begin again, and it's because of the grace of God. And this dimension of who the Christ is, who the story of Christmas is a story of that grace, that story of new beginnings and fresh starts. And I think we experience it at Christmas time. We experience it at Christmas. I think it's a reset for us. And if there's any time in my lifetime that we need a reset, it's right now. I think we all need a reset. I mean, I'm so over 2020. This is a time when I need a fresh start. I need a new beginning. I don't know about you, but I am totally ready for that. I think most of us are. I mean, I go online and I see the memes, and some of them, frankly, are pretty hilarious. I mean, I saw this one the other day. It says that 2020 was a unique leap year. February had 29 days, March had 300 days, and April is 5 years, and I would add to that, and we seem to be stuck in May. Another one that I saw, I like this one. It's, if 2020 were a bag of chips, they would be these: toothpaste and orange juice flavored chips. If 2020 were a bag of chips. I like this one. If 2020 was the year that we put on armor and we were prepared for 2020, this is 2020. There. Yeah. I like this next one. It's if 2020 were a hula hoop. Well, my favorite one was from our own El Arroyo downtown. Their billboard outside, they said, just wait till 2020 turns 21 and starts drinking. Not very hopeful, but hilarious. And you see, that's part of grace. Part of grace is, in fact, this idea that we can get a fresh start, because we all need a fresh start. We all need a second chance. We all need a new beginning. Throughout the course of our lives, we need resets, and grace promises us that there is no flaw, there is no failure, there is no fall that is so catastrophic that you cannot emerge from it. But that's only part of the story of grace. When it says that he was full of grace and truth, it means that we displaced, God took our debt. The way that I was taught to understand grace was as an acronym, GRACE, God's riches at Christ's expense. You see, the fullness of grace doesn't simply mean that we have a new beginning. It means we have a new righteousness. We have a new resource. God takes from us our debt and gives to us his wealth. That we are positionally seated in the heavenlies with our Savior. It's already accomplished. It's already done. It's already paid for. And the balance sheet has gone from debtor to infinitely wealthy. I think this is what Dickens understood. I think this is what Charles Dickens understood as he was penning the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and the transition that took place in his three visions of his past and his present and his future, the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. You know the story. But the transformation of Ebenezer Scrooge is the story of the transformation of grace, that it changes us. That when we realize that we can begin again, we can have a second chance, we realize what Ebenezer Scrooge realized. That we are blessed and we have wealth and we can start again. I think that's what draws us to the story of A Christmas Carol, is because the transforming power of grace. But you see, that's only half of the impossible convergence. The other half of the impossible convergence is truth. There's no way that Ebenezer Scrooge would enter into that transformation without an encounter with the truth, without seeing himself as he really is. Because that birth that we celebrate was the convergence of 100% grace and 100% truth. Undeniable, unavoidable, inescapable truth about who we are and who God is. It just seems to me that the truth is harder to sort out anymore. It's hard for me to know what is true. I read and I watch and I listen and I pay attention and I do my homework and I try to say, what is really true? What is really true anymore? And it just seems to get fuzzier and fuzzier around the edges. It's harder and harder in a society that embraces relativism and situational realities and truth. It's harder to know what is the truth. Because the reality about truth is that it's true whether you believe it or not. It's true all the time. Truth is always true. Absolute truth is unchanging. It is immutable. I think that's the outrageous claim of the original story of the gospel. I think that's the outrageous claim of John. Is that what we celebrate every Christmas is the promise that there is unchanging truth, that in the universe that we live in, that it is built on a foundation of immutable, reliable, righteous truth. And that we can seek that truth and know it's there. And in an age where, in a time, in a season where it seems like everything is changing, everything is unreliable, that is a tremendous promise. And that's how John tells the story. That's how John tells the story of the birth of Jesus. He says that the Logos, the Word, became flesh. The Word became like us. The Logos walked where we walk and felt what we felt. The Word felt pain and felt joy and felt hungry and felt tired. It felt satisfied. The Word lived where we lived, made His habitation, His dwelling among us. And in that we see the glory of God that God has invested in us, the Imago Dei, the image of God. And it's in its fullness. It's a one and only thing. It's a one-time thing. And it came directly from the character of a loving Heavenly Father. and it possesses the divine convergence of heaven and earth, of the eternal and the temporal, the immutable and the changeable, the fragile and the indestructible. That is grace and truth. I don't know if Charles Dickens, I don't know what his theological convictions were. I really don't. I probably should do more study and try and figure out exactly the kind of faith that Charles Dickens had. But he captures that idea, that convergence, that transformation, the transforming power of grace and truth. He captures it in that story. And I believe that is why it is the second most popular Christmas story ever told. So how did you vote? How did you vote? What was your favorite? Do we get the results from that? Do we have them somewhere? They're backstage. They're still counting. Well, while we're waiting for that, let me share with you my personal top 5. My personal top 5 favorite before I share with you. Oh, we got them? Friendly? All right. Oh, these are fresh. Okay, good. So let me share with you what you said, and then I'll share with you the correct ones, which are mine. Number 5 was a tie. Ooh, this is interesting. Between the 2009 version of A Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey. Remember, you ever see that one? It's kind of an animated, kind of faux, it's kind of creepy actually, Christmas Carol. And the 1984 George C. Scott version. Good call, General Patton. That's good. Number 3, this is good. This is good for those of you who voted. Number 3 is the 1951 version with Alistair Sim. That was voted by the New York Times as the best, most critically acclaimed. Number 2, and this is where we will disagree, was you voted The Muppet Christmas Carol as number 2. And number 1, you voted for Bill Murray, 1988 Scrooge, as the most popular Christmas Carol. Well, I beg to differ with you. Let me share with you my 5 top favorite of all time. Number 5 for me is Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, but that really represents all of the animated versions, the Flintstones and the Jetsons. My Little Pony has a Christmas Carol version. Thomas the Tank Engine has a Christmas Carol version. Scooby-Doo has, and they're all wonderful. They're all beautiful things. Number 4 for me is a movie that nobody ever thinks of. It's called Ghosts of Girlfriends Past. It's a Christmas Carol story about a guy and his girlfriends, and the lead actor is our friend and riverbender, Matthew McConaughey. And you may say, well, how did that make the list? Well, he's a riverbender. When you're in a Christmas Carol movie, we'll put you on the list. The next one is a tie between what I think are the 4 best versions of A Christmas Carol. The 1951 Alistair Sim version, which the New York Times said is the finest version. The Albert Finney and Alec Guinness, otherwise known as Obi-Wan Kenobi version, the George C. Scott version, and the Jean-Luc Picard or Patrick Stewart version. Those 4, to me, are all equal. Number 2 on my list is Scrooged with Bill Murray. And if you ask me someday, I will tell you the story of when I met Bill Murray over at UT at a football game with a riverbender named John T. Baker. It's a hilarious story. You don't have time to share it. But Bill Murray's version, Scrooge, is number 2. And number 1, with a rocket, and I don't know how you can disagree with me, is A Muppet's Christmas Carol. The finest Christmas Carol version ever made. And you know why? It's because of Michael Caine. Michael Caine talks about the Muppets, and he talks about Bob Cratchit, who is Kermit the Frog, who is married to Miss Piggy. There is no greater convergence of the impossible than a frog that marries a pig and plays in A Christmas Carol with Michael Caine, and they have a little baby frog who uses a crutch. because he's Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim says to us what I say to you today. God bless us, everyone. Merry Christmas.